like I was talking about. Okay, so first of all, you see here, we were supposed to, of course, have our conference. Oh, I see, I forgot to change I changed the May 14th. We were originally going to have it May 15th this year. It is now going to be held. We have made the decision, it's May 14th, 2022, not 2021. So I have to change that date. And we probably will be still holding it at the Hotel Clique, but we're not 100% sure of that at this point in time. And so just be aware, mark that on your calendar for 2022. We are not holding it this September with the vaccination rollout being kind of unsure. We just thought it was safer to hold it next year instead of holding it this year. However, we do have something really exciting coming up. And that is this May 15th, when we were supposed to have our big in-person conference. We're going to have a little mini We Can Reason Skepticamp. And it's going to be different than a regular conference where you have longer sessions. These are going to be very short sessions. They're going to be 20-minute talks with 10-minute Q&A afterwards. An hour lunch. We're going to start it at 10 a.m. It goes to 4 p.m. We're going to start with like a fun little quiz. So it's going to be just a really fun day. So I hope you guys will mark your calendars and spend a day with us online. And if you are interested in speaking and have a good topic that is skeptical, then please submit to me, Adrienne Hill, and you can reach me alhill42@gmail.com. Oh, I shouldn't do that one, should I? I should do alhill at atheistcalgary.com. Bad me. I'll put that in the chat so that you can do that. It's such a habit to say my regular email. It doesn't matter. You can contact me either way. So from there, we're really good about this, but just as a general
Adrienne,
yep.
Sorry, I just want to jump in. That is going to be free. The online Skepticamp will be free. We're just going to ask for some donations.
Yes, thank you very much, Janalee. Thank you. That's a kind of an important point that I missed, isn't it? Thanks for jumping in. So as usual, just make sure that the discussions and questions are kind. This group is so great. I am not worried at all about it, but I just want to remind you that we need to be kind to one another, no insults, etc. And please to donate any amount you can. Again, we're not doing in-person events where we can walk around and ask for donations, so we're doing it virtually. And I will put that atheistcalgary.com/donate into the chat, but please, feel free to go and donate anytime. Also go to our webpage. It's at the top now. You can also become a member. And during the Q&A, please remember to put your questions in the chat and I will read them out. So those who are listening via the stream will know the questions, as well as some people direct message me. So not everybody sees them. So I will read them out to everybody so that you are aware what the question is that's being answered. And I'm really excited tonight about this topic. I think it's going to be really interesting. I don't know a whole lot about animal agriculture and the environment. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and it is going to be presented with our own Mike Robinson tonight, who is a regular attendee of these. So Mike, I'm going to just stop sharing the screen and it is going to be yours.
Okay.
And you may go ahead and start when you are ready.
Thank you. Are you guys seeing my screen at this point?
Oh, here, just before you get started, I found something out about Zoom recently, just today, actually. If you go to your view at the top, make sure you are in gallery view. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to spotlight Mike, and then we should be able to see him, but I can't see where he is right now. Oh, there he is. Okay, now I've got him. So I'm going to spotlight him, and then when you share your screen, it should work. Does everyone see Mike now? Perfect. All right, way to go. Sorry about that, Mike.
All right. All right. Share the screen.
It's down at the bottom. Little green square says share your screen. Yeah.
I did that. I selected the screen I want to share. Are you guys not seeing it yet?
No, we're not.
Oh, I hit the share button. That's why. There we go.
Now we're seeing it. Well done. I'll mute myself now.
Okay. So welcome, everyone. It's been a really interesting process to answer this question, come up with a skeptical examination of animal agriculture and the environment. What leads into this is that probably most vegans, of which I'm one, many environmentalists argue that animal agriculture is bad for the environment, but others argue that done properly, not only can animal agriculture be sustainable, but can actually be good for the environment. So I've taken on the challenge in this presentation to look at both sides skeptically and try and come to what I believe is some reflection of the truth. So before I try to actually answer this question, I'm going to give you a few disclosures. So for most of my life, I ate meat and other animal products and didn't see any problem with it. I always considered myself an environmentalist, and I didn't really see any conflict there at that time. But about 10 years ago, I became a vegan for ethical reasons. And as a vegan, I believe it's wrong to unnecessarily harm or exploit animals for any reason. So I don't eat animals or purchase animal products or attend things like rodeos and stuff. While I became vegan for ethical reasons, I also came to believe that animal agriculture was bad for the environment and bad for our health. However, as a skeptic, I feel it's important to examine the evidence rather than just accept a point of view that reinforces my beliefs. So to prepare for this presentation, I spent many hours, many more than I thought I would spend, examining with a skeptical eye the various claims on either side of the argument, which was not an easy task. I'm not a scientist and I have no experience working in agriculture. So I relied entirely on my internet searching skills to do my research, and tried as much as possible to not allow my vegan bias to come get in the way of evaluating the available evidence. And as much as possible, I've used Canadian and Albertan data, although a certain amount of what I'm using in this presentation is US based or global. And a lot of it just has to do with where I can find information. I can't always obtain Canadian-based information on all these things I'll be discussing. One of the things I did discover is there's a lot of different numbers thrown around, and it can be really hard to know which numbers to believe. What I think is key here, though, is pretty much all the numbers are estimates based on various assumptions. And so when examining any study, whether on this topic or any other topic, it's always important to look at who's sponsoring it and how they may have manipulated data to get it to say what they want. So you're going to see, probably, you may notice some conflicting numbers in this presentation, and that's again just simply because of the fact that different sources have different variations of the numbers they choose to use, but I'll try and explain which numbers I believe are correct, shall we say, and which ones might not be. And that's half the fun of doing any of these kind of things, is deciding which numbers are which. So before I get directly into the impacts, let's just examine how much animal products we eat. So according to the sources I was able to come up with, our annual per capita meat consumption in Canada is lower than the US. The US basically is pretty much one of the highest meat and animal product consuming countries in the world. And Canada is not that far behind. But as you can see here, we eat 40 pounds of beef, 37 pounds of pork, 77 pounds of chicken, 9 pounds of turkeys, and 49 pounds of seafood, for a total of about 212 pounds of animal products every year. Again, that varies greatly from person to person, but that's the per capita numbers that it averages out to. So to compare this to the rest of the world, this chart here, North America is there in the middle, and I put a little red line around the animal protein bar. And this shows on a per capita basis how much animal protein we consume versus total protein versus vegetable protein dairy products, and so on. And so North America is the highest there in terms of animal protein. There's a correlation between meat consumption and per capita income. This slide also, if you look at the title at the top, you'll notice the date. This is an unfortunate reality of trying to do this kind of research. Often, I use the most current numbers I can find, but sometimes the numbers I find are a little bit dated, but I still use them if I think they're still relevant to today. But what this slide really shows is it's generally the countries where people have the highest per capita income that they consume more animal products. And the thing about that, though, is as these other countries start moving up on the economic scale, they tend to want to imitate the countries that have had all the money and economic power in the past. So what that means is these countries like India and China and so on that have a much greater population than us will likely, as time goes on, imitate our eating habits more and more. So whatever impact we're having on the environment here in Canada and the United States is going to be magnified over time as more of the world population imitates us unless things change. Global meat production has been increasing throughout the world. And this chart highlights the fact that even though North America on a per capita basis consumes a lot more animal products, Asia, simply because of their vast numbers, about 4.5 billion, end up consuming or producing about 3 times as much meat than North America does. And pretty much all of these are increasing over time. Okay, so let's have a look at the possible impacts of animal agriculture. I will focus in on 3 areas: greenhouse gas emissions / climate change, water consumption and pollution, land usage, and effects on wildlife habitat. So starting with greenhouse gas emissions, what gases are we talking about? Well, the 3 primary gases that have greenhouse gases that have to do with animal agriculture, and agriculture in general for that matter. But there's methane, or CH4, primarily from ruminants such as cows when they burp as a result of the processes that go on inside their stomachs as they digest their food. There's nitrous oxide, or NO2, along with methane that comes from manure that's produced by the animals. And there's carbon dioxide, which primarily from an agricultural point of view is absorbed rather than given off. And what's crucial here is what's the balance that's going on between the amount of these gases going into the atmosphere and the amount of these gases being taken out of the atmosphere, and the relative impact of the different gases on global warming and hence climate change. So global warming potential, or GWP, is probably the primary measurement that's used in terms of how much energy the emission of 1 ton of a gas will absorb over a given period of time relative to CO2. CO2 is the most plentiful greenhouse gas and therefore is used as our baseline and has a GWP of 1. Methane has a GWP between 28 and 36 over 100 years, or 84 to 87 over 20 years. And I'll explain what's going on there on the next slide. Nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of about 265 to 298 over 100 years. In other words, it's close to 300 times as bad a greenhouse gas as CO2. Okay, so when we're trying to compare these different gases and what their impact is, or warming potential is, it's complicated. I spent many hours becoming a methane expert, pretty much trying to figure out how all this stuff works. so that I can try and condense it down into something real short and simple for this presentation. So just understand there's an awful lot of complexity and science behind this. All right, CO2 lasts anywhere from 20 years to thousands of years. So generally about 65 to 80% of it will be absorbed by the land and the oceans over a period of 20 to 200 years, but the rest of it could stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. And so really what's key there is once CO2 gets pumped in the atmosphere, it's going to stay there for quite a while and affect climate for quite a while. Methane, on the other hand, is mostly removed from the atmosphere in about 12 years or less. Generally, 8 to 12 years is the numbers that are used. So if methane lasts only for about 12 years, how do we talk about it over 20 or 100 years? Well, as this chart shows, the idea when it's actually first released. So if I did a one-time release of a ton of CO2 into the air, you would have a certain amount of energy absorption and therefore heating. If I did the same ton of methane into the air, how long is that 1 ton of methane going to stay there and affect the environment? So initially, it's actually going to absorb about 120 times as much heat as the same amount of CO2. But because it oxidates and turns into basically CO2 and water vapor, by about 10 years, it's down close to 100 times as much. By 20 years, its heating impact is down to 84 to 87 times as much as the same amount of CO2. And out at about 100 years, it's still somewhere around 30 times as much global warming impact as CO2. By that point, most of the methane is long gone, but the high front-end loading of the energy absorption it does carries on through, so that even 100 years from now, it's still having in the neighborhood of 30 times the impact of the same amount of CO2. Nitrous oxide, on the other hand, is much more powerful a greenhouse gas, but again, it lasts for about 100, slightly over 100 years usually, about 114 years. So it's a suitable one to talk about over a 100-year period of time. There's other greenhouse gases like CFCs and so on, but they're relatively small impact and have little to do with animal agriculture. Water vapor, actually, you may or may not know about this, but water vapor is also an effective absorber of heat energy in the air, but it doesn't accumulate in the atmosphere the same way these other greenhouse gases do. It's very short-lived, stays in the air for hours to days. And the amount of water vapor in the world is pretty much consistent. Although there is a feedback loop effect in that as the air gets warmer, it can hold more water vapor. So water vapor actually can have a bit of a feedback loop to amplify the global warming caused by these other gases. All right, but given the fact that methane, which is one of the major gases involved in animal agriculture, has a very heavy front-end load, I'm going to remind you numerous times through this presentation that the typical thing when people look at the impact of methane compared to CO2, they're using the 100-year timeline. But I'm not that worried, frankly, about global warming 100 years from now. I'm worried about the next 10, 20 years. So we need to keep in mind that the methane that's being released today is having a much bigger impact on global warming than the CO2 and then the typical numbers that are quoted. Okay, this also just a quick slide here to show there's a number of places that methane gets into the air from. And this slide shows a lot of them. The light blue there is the enteric fermentation, i.e. the cow burps. So you can see that's a big chunk of the amount of methane that's getting out in. And this slide also projects where it's going over the next 20 to 30 years. Natural gas, of course, is another major source of it. It's not so much the burning of natural gas, it's the methane that leaks and doesn't get burnt, that leaks into the atmosphere from natural gas wells and so on. Okay, so let's have a look now at the livestock implications, now that we know something about these gases. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, they say livestock produces around 14.5% of all global greenhouse gases. This number is disputed by the animal agriculture industry, and I'll get into that coming up. My personal view is this is actually a low number. Again, because in all these official slides and stuff, they're using that 20 or 100-year comparisons where the methane's only about 32 times as powerful as CO2, but again, in the near future, all the methane, which is a primary gas released by animal agriculture, is having a much bigger impact in the nature of 80 times as much as CO2. But on the graph on the left here, it shows that North America, where it fits in terms of million tons of CO2 equivalent released from agriculture, and the major sources of that, the dark blue there being from beef, that's the biggest chunk. LAC stands for Latin America and Caribbean, so that would include countries like Brazil, which is another major cattle country. And they also, you've probably heard, you know, these minor little stories in the news about the Amazon being burnt up. And a chunk of that is not even so much for cattle production in Brazil itself, but Brazil actually exports a lot of animal feed to Europe. And that is one of the sources of the Amazon destruction. Okay, to translate it slightly from just tons of CO2 being spewed into the air, the chart on the right compares that to million tons of CO2 when compared for the amount of protein produced. And when you look at that, you see that in North America, the gases being produced by the beef is much higher than the portion of protein that gets produced from beef. So that's something to keep in mind. This slide is to then now let's take a look from a Canadian perspective. And it shows, according to the government of Canada, how much greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And so that light blue second from the top is all agriculture, not just animal, but all agriculture in Canada. And that's responsible officially for about 10% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. the stuff that us humans cause versus the natural. There's all kinds of greenhouse gases produced in nature even without us. But this is the stuff we're producing. And as you can see here in Canada, oil and gas and transportation are the two biggies. This helps put in perspective, though, all the arguments that we're going to talk about here in terms of how much effect is animal agriculture having on global warming. You have to keep in mind how much of the greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. Again, I'm going to remind you, this is based on the 100-year time frame. So if you were to, and I'll throw some numbers at you a little bit later, but if you look at in the short term, the agriculture is going to be higher than that. So of those agricultural emissions, probably about 50% of those come from livestock. And so in other words, 5% of the total. This shows CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions and removals from Canadian agriculture from 1990 to 2009. Interesting thing, if you look along the bottom there, the orange, which is the carbon dioxide, is in fact that Canadian croplands have been a net sink for CO2 starting in about 1990. But until about the year 2000, removal of cropland were offset Removals from croplands were offset by carbon losses from forest and grasslands being converted to cropland. But the annual total greenhouse gas emissions from farms in Canada increased from 1990 to 2009. The main driver of this increase is beef and swine populations. Nitric oxide emissions from Canadian farms accounts for about half the warming effect of agricultural emissions, and they're produced in nature by microbes as they process nitrogen in soils. All soils emit some nitric oxide, but farm soils often emit more than others because of the nitrogen added to the soil from fertilizers, manure, and other inputs. So different kinds of animals produce different amounts of greenhouse gases, and this chart gives you a quick comparison of that. Lamb and beef being the two biggest ones. This also shows the emissions that are before the product leaves the farm, the green part, and the orange part is the additional emissions that are added on in the processing, transportation, retail, cooking, and all that stuff. We don't tend to eat a lot of lamb here in Canada. It's also a ruminant, so it's similar to beef in producing methane. The big difference here is you get a lot more meat off of a cow than you do off of a lamb. So since beef is the biggie when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, let's focus a bit on beef and its effect on greenhouse gases. At least 25% of today's global warming is caused by man-made methane emissions, and Environmental Defense Fund calculation, that's based on an Environmental Defense Fund calculation based on IPCC report. Cattle and other ruminants produce 37% of the methane emissions resulting from human activity, according to the UN. And livestock also accounts for 9% of the CO2 and 65% of the nitric oxide. A single cow on average produces between 70 and 120 kilograms of methane per year. And worldwide, there's about 1.5 billion cattle. So that's a lot of methane and other gases. Methane, as I mentioned before, is at least 84 times more potent than CO2 in the first 2 decades of its release. All right, so there's lots of debate out there about grass-fed slash pasture-raised versus grain-fed or feedlot-raised beef from many points of view. In fact, some of you may have seen these recent A&W ads that are saying now all our burgers are grass-fed. So why is everybody pushing this grass-fed thing? Let's have a little closer look. First, you've got to understand that there's no official definitions of these terms. It's totally up to the industry to say whatever they want to say about what's grass-fed and what's grain-fed and all that sort of stuff. But this is in general what's true about it. All cattle start their life grass-fed out on pasture land. The term grass-fed or grain-fed really typically means grass-finished or grain-finished. And grass is a bit of a loosey-goosey term in that, in particular in Canada, that can include things like hay, because we have this thing called winter, and the grass doesn't grow so good in the wintertime. It's also important to understand, again, they all start out on the pastures eating the grass, but at some point the grass finished stay on the grass and or hay and such for during the winter months, and the other cows end up on a feedlot to get fattened up on grain. In US, that's mostly corn. In Canada, it's mostly other grains. But as a result of that difference, so again, the beginning part of the life, all the same, it's the end part that makes the big difference. So the grass finished 6 to 10 months, depending on the grass, and they're typically, using this nice euphemistic term, harvested, in other words, slaughtered. 20 to 26 months at a weight of between about 1,000 and 1,200 pounds, whereas the grain finished, it only takes 4 to 6 months to fatten them up, and they tend to get up 1,200 to 1,400 pounds because that higher efficiency of the grain that's being fed to them, they put on weight a lot faster. Now, given that, is grass finished or grain finished better for the environment? Well, the beef industry can't even agree on this one because it depends on whether you're a grass-fed beef farmer or a grain-fed beef farmer. But according to the a study that was conducted by Oklahoma State University titled Carbon Footprint Comparison Between Grass and Grain-Finished Beef, I quote from the study, the combination of consuming higher energy, lower forage diet, shorter time spent on feed during finishing and heavier carcass weights translated to a 18.5 to 67.5% lower carbon footprint for grain-finished beef as compared to grass-finished beef. So from at least that's what the science says. Proponents of grass-finished argue, on the other hand, because of carbon sequestering, grass-finished can have a lower carbon footprint. However, even they will admit to produce the same amount of meat will take grass finishing takes about twice as much land to do it and longer time. And that's kind of the big difference there. The argument sort of comes in is how much carbon is being sequestered by that pasture land. And that's where the grass finished proponents claim they have even made claims to say they are not only carbon neutral, they're actually carbon negative. And we're going to dig into that. This is a presentation I'm stealing parts from. There's actually, they made a movie called this. This is just a presentation. The author is a book and a movie, and this is parts from a presentation the author did. Talking about a type of grass-finished beef, in which terms regenerative grazing. It's based on an idea championed by Alan Savory. Some of you may have heard of. He's a South African fellow who says he's going to cure all the problems of the world with his regenerative farming practices, which he claims can regenerate the land and make it better. Anyways, this presentation will talk a bit about that. It's some of the things in here are specific to regenerative grazing, but they also apply in general to grass-finished beef.
Hi, thank you for watching this virtual presentation. My name is Diana Rogers, and I'm a registered dietitian and also live on a working farm in New England. And I think the biggest misunderstanding against cows right now is the methane, that they're so awful for the environment. But when you actually look at the contribution that their emissions make compared to transportation, you can see on this chart that cattle are only producing about 2% of the global US greenhouse gas emissions compared to transportation, electricity, and industry. So cattle aren't really the big problem that many are making it out to be. The claims that cattle are actually worse than livestock come from a report where they were comparing the total life cycle emissions. So up at the top, you can see everything that went into producing meat. So the feed, the animal emissions, the processing emissions, everything to the table. But yet they don't have that same life cycle assessment done for transportation. And so it's not really a fair comparison. So the second chart here, you can see that if we're just looking at tailpipe emissions, so not including the full life cycle, livestock are only contributing about 5% worldwide compared to 14% for transportation. And some of you might be familiar with the White Oak Pastures study that was done not too long ago, which actually showed that for every Impossible or Beyond burger you ate, you actually had to eat a grass-fed burger from White Oak Pastures in order to offset your emissions. So cattle that are raised in a regenerative way can actually sequester carbon and are better in terms of emissions than Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger. And this actually brings me to my favorite graphic, which is actually a poster that you can get on sacredcow.info. But it's just sort of showing the carbon cycle and how cattle are, yes, they're emitting methane, but it's actually getting converted to water and CO2. That water comes back down to the ground as rain, and the CO2 is used in the photosynthesis process. And so this is really a cycle that we're talking about. It's a biological cycle.
All right, sounds pretty rosy, doesn't it? Let's hear a counterpoint of view.
Hey, it's Mike here, and today, regenerative grazing, eco-beef, environmentally friendly beef, whatever you want to call it, we are going to debunk some of the claims around it, and in particular focus on a recent 2020 study on white oak pastures. We're going to look at the carbon-related claims in this study, as well as ones previously made by white oak pastures. I have some help from Dr. Tushar Mehta, who is a data enthusiast who has done a deep dive into this, wrote an article on medium.com, so he will be here helping.
White oak pastures is essentially part of this global infrastructure. They present this real family farm kind of thing, which they use.
I just want to say I personally know a lot of people who are well-intentioned to have just bought the regenerative grazing thing, hook, line, and sinker. And what's not to love about it if you eat beef? It's saying that you can save the planet while eating beef. But they might have seen Alan Savory's TED Talk, who's the poster child of grazing, or poster old South African dude, or just another presentation on some flashy carbon numbers or before and after pictures, and thought, this looks great, but they didn't get the full picture. I just want to say, yes, obviously I'm a vegan. I don't support eating animals, but I will say that when I was doing my sustainability degree, I bought into the Alan Savory thing. It was actually taught as a part of my degree. And even after being vegan for a few years, I just looked at it as, oh yeah, that's a more eco way to eat meat. Not much different than how chicken has a lower carbon footprint than beef does. But obviously I was like, oh, ethically, I don't support the eating of any animals. But what eventually shifted my perspective was the science showing that the claims made about these grazing techniques are just not correct. And of course, now we are looking at the newer generation of these claims. So let's go. That brings us to this paper in the journal Frontiers Sustainability subjournal. It's from late 2020, and it looked at white oak pastures, which they abbreviate as WOC.
We look at the baseline characteristics of the white oaks pastures. They're just very basic, is that they're 3,000 acre farm with mainly cattle, chickens, and pigs. There's some other animals too, but minority. It started on an area that's very degraded by prior peanut, cotton farming, and things like that. So it's using very degraded land. And we know that if you use degraded land to start with, you can then store more carbon in that land as you sort of bring it back closer to the baseline.
So for the regenerative grazing sort of sequence, they start by adding compost, which is worth noting, and then they implement Alan Savory's holistic planned grazing, which is intensive rotational grazing with a host of other principles. So this video also should act as a response to Savory's methods, which are supposed to save the world. We'll see. So we have a pretty large operation here with a ton of different animals that started on degraded land. So what are the results after 20 years in terms of maybe land use and carbon savings?
And the claims they make is that they're, eco-friendly, and that they use 2.5 times the land for their animals as compared to conventional farming of the same animals, grouping them together, and 66% less carbon than regular animal agriculture, the comparison that they're using.
So they say they use 66% less carbon than conventional systems. And I find that really interesting, which brings me to their previous 2019 report where they actually claimed that their beef was carbon negative. I just think it's funny that the moment these numbers have to make into a peer-reviewed journal, they go from being negative to, maybe just a third as much as a conventional system. I'm going to mention that 2019 report was by Qantas, which is a sustainability consulting firm. So it was commissioned by the company. And as Tushar, his co-author, mentioned in their article, Qantas is pretty questionable, makes things questionable because in their previously commissioned reports by Nestle, they concluded that allowing water bottles in national parks was ecologically all right. You might be thinking, oh, Qantas, yeah, that was like a less reputable report, but this is a totally different study, unconnected. Well, it turns out the main author of that Qantas report is also an author of this Frontier study in 2020.
And there's people who are the academics behind the study appear in movies like Sacred Cow and connect right back to Alan Savory. And then just within a few minutes later, their McDonald's and other chains are posting their things about eco meat. So it's kind of like a coordinated industry, multi-level sort of effort, it seems.
Sacred Cow is a pro-grazing documentary, and I'd also worth mentioning right up front the financial conflicts of interest, and that brings me to how this whole thing was funded entirely by General Mills.
The majority of the cattle meat that comes from White Oaks pastures is bought by General Mills for one of their eco products.
And General Mills does own Epic Provisions, and that is a meat company, which all right, now let's take a closer look at what is probably the most important subject here, and that is the carbon situation. Especially in the documentaries and the presentations, there's this notion that there's some magical quality to grazing that leads to this extra sequestration that wouldn't occur if those animals weren't on the land. Like, large mammals are required, completely ignoring that there were, for example, no native large mammals in New Zealand, yet its ecosystem was able to form just fine. So if there are any issues here, what are they? Well, the first has to do with those other animals that happen to be on the farm besides the cows.
But indeed, there's an external factor that they admit using, that is using 10,000 pounds of hay per acre, and they're sort of getting the land going in early stages. Okay, that's fine, they did that once. But the thing that they don't really highlight in the paper is that aside from cattle, the monogastric animals, that means chickens and pigs, animals with one stomach that don't ruminate, they are completely fed, or mostly fed, by feed that comes from off of the land. It's external food source.
Previously spoken about how Polyface Farms, another regenerative agriculture farm, is sort of exposed for doing this, dump trucking on massive amounts of grain from offsite.
They present together more than 50% of the animal carcass weight that is produced on that land. They feed 1.8 million kilograms of feed per year to these monogastric animals, and that produces a significant amount of manure every single year that is sourced from off-farm feed. This manure is applied to the land.
So most of the meat here is being created by off-site nutrients, which have rubbed any sustainability advocate the wrong way. Moving on. The next biggest factor here, as it always is with cows, is methane. And I mentioned this in almost every video on the topic, but oftentimes proponents of grazing go to that 100-year global warming potential, or just looking at the warming that happens within a 100-year time span based off different greenhouse gases.
So methane is accounted in 100-year timescales as opposed to 20-year timescales. In many cases, it's better to account it over 20 years because the half-life of methane is very short.
That 100-year time span puts methane in at about 32 times more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. But then when you're cranking it down to that 20-year time frame, which is most relevant here, we're talking about 86 times more powerful than CO2. So looking to their chart, if their initial number is assumed to be correct, that 7.2 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year jumps up to about 19 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year. Ouch. So let's put that 19 million up against their sequestration, which is about 2,290 kilograms of carbon per hectare. Multiply that by about 1,200 hectares, and then you need to multiply that by 3.7 to turn the carbon into CO2. That's 10.3 million kilograms of CO2 sequestered, but we have about an additional 11.7 million due to the methane over 20 years to add to the total farm emissions. So instead of being 13 million, like they say, there actually would be closer to 25 million. So instead of just emitting a measly 3 million kilograms of CO2, the reality is that they're 5 times higher than that at nearly 15 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per year, totally destroyed. This further emphasizes that the claim of carbon negative beef that they had in their 2019 Qantas report is just complete and total nonsense. Especially, they said that it was more eco than a Beyond Burger or even straight soybeans, which are super low on the scale. And so it becomes very clear that when the same group of people, the same farm, the same project, showing a massively different figure in the peer-reviewed literature, that original Qantas report needs to be entirely disqualified. And if anybody uses it, they're using bad data. And furthermore, it should be legal for white oak pastures to continue making claims that their beef is carbon negative and using graphics like these. Anyway, continuing on that 20-year time frame, that seems to be especially important when we look at what is called soil carbon saturation. Simply put, this is when the soil's carbon tank becomes full under the current type of system. So the soil's been fully saturated with carbon in terms of a grazing system, for example. Well, the documentaries will never go into this. The one seemingly unbiased thing that these two reports did in 2020 and 2019 were that they actually mentioned that this was occurring. And they go as far as to say that the slowing rate of sequestration, quote, may suggest a peak soil carbon accumulation at approximately 13 years, at which point they would just go back to spewing methane and the operational fossil fuels and not be storing anything else. Imagine how ridiculous it would be to promote a new special type of solar panel that after just 13 years starts burning coal. It's also worth noting they put a linear line on their soil carbon storage chart, but the dots look more like that hockey stick that is classic to a soil saturation chart. That's a much more realistic fit. So when we're talking about methane over a 15-year, even 13-year window, it becomes even worse because we're talking about the range of 100 times as powerful greenhouse gas as CO2. You can start to see that this is not the best way to fight climate change. And you might have to ask, why does the soil become saturated? Why does this stop? And one likely reason is that because you have animals constantly grazing over this land, the grass is never getting more than about 2 feet high. The roots are not going to be getting super deep. Compare that to something like native big blue stem grass, which gets about 8 feet high with roots that go 12 feet deep. But it could be even worse because it's possible that we are undercounting methane in these ruminant systems even more. Here's Tushar.
So there's a really good paper called Underestimates of US Emissions and Global Implications for Industrializing Animal Agriculture by Professor Matthew Hayek. Now, he's published this paper, and it's not in a peer-reviewed journal, but I think I've communicated with them, and I think that they're planning on getting this data published in a peer-reviewed journal. The calculations for methane from animal agriculture are what he considers bottom-up, meaning that they take the cattle and the manure and all the different things they do with the manure, as well as the different feeds for cattle and how long they live, etc. And they calculate that. They calculate the methane emissions based on that. Top-down measurements, for example, if you look at satellite data or from airplanes flying over and using different ways to scan for the methane emissions coming from animal agriculture operations, and other air measurements, generally it seems to exceed the bottom-up calculation.
The paper says top-down estimates indicate that the total U.S. animal methane emissions are 39 to 90% higher than bottom-up models predict, and that official reports like those by the EPA and in peer-reviewed literature are routinely underestimated.
Okay, so after watching those two videos from different points of view, then I was faced to try and say, okay, what's valid here in these two cases? And certainly, so I did, for one thing, I tried to follow the trail to where this information comes from. This is just a quick example of, so in that chart that was used in the Sacred Cow video, the orange one here on the left, they said that livestock category beef represents only 2% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. And then if you look in the fine print at the bottom there, it has a URL for where this information came from. So I went there. And the pie chart on the right here is from that EPA site. And it shows something very similar to their bar chart, with the transportation, electricity being 28, about 28% each, fair enough, and industry being another 22%. But the interesting thing they did is they took that 10% that's agriculture and split it into two bars so that they look much smaller. They also then, I don't know how, came up with 3.9% for livestock. There was nothing on the EPA site that broke it down to that level. And they further broke it down to saying 2% is beef. again, that information was not on the EPA site. What was on the EPA site, however, was this breakdown, that of that 10% that is attributable to agriculture, agricultural soil is responsible for almost 55%. The enteric fermentation, about 30%. Manure management, another 13%. And then the rest is various other stuff. So again, I don't know where they did their math from, but when I do my math, it appears to me, and again, of that red bar there, the 55%, that soil management, well, some of that soil is also being used to grow the crops that they feed to the cows. So anyways, I figure, and also if you take into account the 20-year versus the 100-year global warming potential, I did some math and I figure the emissions is closer to 6 to 9%. Nonetheless, there is a valid, then you still have to take that and say, okay, in the big picture of things, it's still a relatively small percent compared to all the other sources of greenhouse gases. Fair enough. They also make this point about the life cycle emissions, and this is another valid point that they made, in that that 14.5% number that gets thrown around from the UN studies is a full life cycle. So they're taking into account the greenhouse gases and stuff that was produced in the producing of the feed and stuff that gets fed to cattle, as well as the manure and the burps. And yes, again, most methane is not cow farts, it's cow burps. And then all the other parts, and that adds up to about 14.5%. And but when you look at the transportation, it's generally people don't, when they look at the transportation sector, they don't try to do a life cycle analysis. They just say, well, how much gases are coming out the tailpipe of your car when you're driving it versus what's all the emissions from producing that oil in the first place, refining it, and all that, and the greenhouse gas emissions from producing those vehicles, etc. Okay, so we do have to be careful when we're comparing things, that we are, if you're doing life cycle comparisons, you're doing life cycle comparisons. If you're doing direct emissions, you're doing direct emissions. That doesn't change the fact, though, that the life cycle emissions of livestock is about 14.5% of the emissions. So that's a pretty big chunk. Just to go back to that white oak pasture claims that were in the sacred cow thing. I'm not trying to pick particularly on white oak farms, but it does help illustrate how industry in general tries to paint a rosy picture and sometimes distorts information. This chart that is showing a net negative total emissions is, to this day, you can go to White Oaks Pasture's website and you will see that picture there that claims that their beef is carbon negative. Well, and that's based on that Qantas report that was highlighted in the debunking video. Well, I went and looked at that Qantas report, and it includes some things that strangely are not on White Oak Pasture's website, but are in the report. And this is one. There's a section in the report that says, why might the benefits be less than what's shown? And sure enough, it's that lifespan thing of methane. That carbon negative claim is based on 100-year global warming potential of methane, not the 20-year. Oops, I overshot something here. The Qantas report also points out that what was in the debunking video that the carbon sequestering actually slows down over time as the land gets saturated with carbon. So again, they're claiming that the soil sequestering is constant throughout, when in fact it actually drops over time. She also highlighted this little carbon cycle thing, and I'll just replay what she said about that.
Carbon cycle and how cattle are, yes, they're emitting methane, but it's actually getting converted to water and CO2. That water comes back down to the ground as rain, and the CO2 is used in the photosynthesis process. And so this is really a cycle that we're talking about. It's a biological cycle.
Yeah, it's a biological cycle, all right. And it makes it sound like it's totally harmless. What she leaves out is this cycle takes a long time. So that methane, prior to turning into water vapor and CO2, stays in the atmosphere for 8 to 12 years, causing a great deal of global warming. So yeah, nice rosy picture, not telling the full truth. Okay, so I did my own calculations. I said, all right, I want the facts here, so as best I can determine them. I went out there and I found this chart that talked about how much carbon stocks are in various biomasses. And I think this is actually really interesting to point out. The top line, there's tropical forests, and that has a ton per acre of 109, and temperate grasslands, i.e. the kind of lands that the cows are grazing on, has almost the same carbon stock in it. The big difference, though, if you look at the forest, about half of the carbon is in the soil and half in the plant itself, which is a disadvantage when it comes to forest fires, because when the trees start burning, they release that trapped carbon back into the atmosphere. The grasslands, on the other hand, the vast majority of the carbon is in the soil or the roots, and therefore stays there. But that also is why what's really relevant from the offsetting of the emissions is not the total amount of carbon that's stored in the soil, but how much carbon is removed from the atmosphere by the grasslands each year to try and offset the gases going into the atmosphere from the animals. So I found another number, grassland carbon storage rates. One of the real big challenges with all this stuff is it varies a lot. It makes a big difference how dry it is, how wet it is. Is it in Canada? Is it in California? Tons of variation. So I'm working with averages here. So I'm saying somewhere between 0.3 and 1.7. I'm going to call it 1 metric ton for some nice easy math, i.e. 1,000 kilograms of carbon that can be absorbed per acre per year. Okay, a single cow on average produces 70 to 120 kilograms of methane per year. Let's average that at 100. Methane being 84 times more potent than CO2 for the first 20 years. So a single cow would produce 84,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. I also looked it up, and in Alberta, there's typically one cow for 2.75 acres. All right, so 2.75 acres of grazing land would sequester about 2,750 kilograms of CO2 per year. Net result is 8,400 minus 2,750 is 5,650 kilograms of CO2 equivalent added to the atmosphere every year. Nowhere close to carbon neutral, much less carbon negative. If you wanted to be carbon neutral, the break-even point would be about 1 cow per 8.4 acres. So about 3 times as much land is currently being used to graze cattle in Alberta. But also remember, the land becomes saturated So even this rate that I used in my calculations will go down over time. And this is just offsetting methane. That doesn't even touch the nitric oxide. This is something I found according to a national survey conducted by the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So this is from the beef industry. They say the carbon footprint of Canadian beef is about 11.4 kilograms CO2 equivalent per kilogram live weight, or 30.8 kilograms boneless beef in the supermarket. And only about 8% of that is offset by carbon and sequestering. So there you have it. And that number, again, is using the 100-year global warming potential of methane, not the 20-year. So no, beef is nowhere close to being carbon neutral or carbon negative. Okay, let's put this in perspective then. How does eating animal products compare to driving your car? And I'm not here trying to do a life cycle analysis. So I'm using numbers that are just the straight direct tailpipe emissions versus the direct gases emitted by animal agriculture. Going back to that early chart where I listed how much meat Americans and Canadians eat, I did the math, and this is what I came out with, that the amount of beef a typical Canadian eats equates to almost 2,000 kilometers of driving, pork about 800 kilometers, and so on. A grand total of almost 4,000 kilometers worth of driving is being global greenhouse gas emissions from the meat the average Canadian eats. But wait, that's using that 100-year global warming potential number. Let's update these numbers. If I did the math on just taking the methane part of the emissions, doing the 20-year numbers instead, this is what I come up with. And now for a typical Canadian, you're looking at about 5,500 kilometers worth of driving to equate to the meat you eat. So there you have it. What would you rather do to lower your carbon footprint? Stop eating meat or drive 5,656 kilometers less every year? Okay, let's take it from the animals to the plants. This chart shows kilograms of CO2 equivalent, again, using the 100-year numbers, comparing animal to other products. You'll see here all the low numbers over on the right, with the exception of the 2% milk, are all plant products. And all the big numbers over on the left are the animal products. Now, a kilogram of broccoli and a kilogram of beef are not exactly the same thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about some differentiating there, but none again shows much less greenhouse gas emissions from producing plants than producing animals. So a couple of direct comparisons here. Remember in that that Sacred Cow video, she said you had to eat one of those White Oak Farm burgers in order to offset the carbon emissions of your Beyond Beef burger? Yeah, right. Well, here's the real numbers. The top big red bar there is the amount of carbon given off for the beef burger. And those two nice little short red bars are the CO2 emissions from producing either a Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger, both of which are new meat alternatives that have been engineered to be extremely similar to meat in terms of taste and texture. generally speaking, the Beyond Burger is the one that's available in Canada, and Possible Burger mostly in the States, and it's been championed by the Burger King chain. Over on the milk side, we have dairy milk compared to various plant-based milks. And again, carbon footprint of the dairy is a lot higher. What about eating local? I hear a lot of times people talking about saying, oh yeah, well, you know, it's better to eat local. Well, from a purely greenhouse gas point of view, when you look at the emissions of the transportation part, which is the black on the end of each of those bars versus the other emissions in producing these various products, you see that the transportation is a very small proportion of the greenhouse gas impact of eating these or producing these products. So no, eating local is not better for the environment if you're talking about eating local beef versus eating plant food that's been imported from California or Mexico. I also highlighted a couple of things in this chart because I found them interesting, and that is fairly high up on the chart here is dark chocolate and coffee. As it turns out, they have a fairly high carbon footprint. Palm oil, soybean oil, olive oils, also pretty much all the oils are up there. They're very highly refined products. So yeah, they have a pretty high carbon footprint as well. Okay, little video here on talking about a diet that will help fight climate change.
I have to admit that when it comes to food, I'm a total sucker. Whether it's sugar or grease or carbs, pretty much bring it on. I spend a lot of time in Montana. So for me, that medium rare grass-fed ribeye steak, pretty much as good as it gets. I know, I don't do it all. When I do, I gotta admit, I feel conflicted. And that's for a lot of reasons, including the planet. But how big of a problem is what I eat? I mean, does it really make much of a dent in something as huge as global warming? It turns out what we put on our plates matters a lot.
About 25% of all the global climate change problems we're seeing can be attributed back to the food and the choices that we're actually making about what we eat on a daily basis. This is greater than all the cars on the planet. In fact, it's about twice as much global warming pollution as the cars.
Ben Holton and Maya Almiroz studied the connection between climate and diet at the University of California Davis. They tracked how the way we produce food creates greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. With that data, the team has crunched the numbers to figure out how much carbon pollution is produced by different foods and different diets.
A lot of people feel really hopeless when it comes to climate change, like they can't make a difference. And what our research is showing is that your personal decisions really can have a big impact.
So take that grass-fed ribeye steak I allow. If you really look at everything that went into making a single serving of beef, you end up emitting around 330 grams of carbon. That's like driving a car 3 miles. Now, if I choose to have chicken instead, there's more than a 5-fold drop in emissions. Switch to fish, and you see the number go down even more. Now, look at veggies. If I swapped beef out entirely for lentils, well, I'm down to practically nothing. So it's to the point now where the US actually has one of the highest meat footprints per capita. So what about not eating meat at all? Vegan is the way to go for the least impact on the planet, but it's not that much different in terms of emissions than, say, a vegetarian diet. And the team found that the environmental impact of the Mediterranean diet is pretty similar to vegan and vegetarian diets. It's a lot less meat heavy than what Americans are used to. So fish and poultry a few times a week, beef maybe once a month, plenty of plant-based foods, and of course, loads of olive oil.
Eliminating like 90% of your meat intake is more important than eliminating all of your meat. We don't all have to be vegan. We don't all even have to be vegetarian. If we can just reduce our meat intake every little bit helps. And if you can bring it down a lot, you can help the climate a lot.
If we all just switch to a Mediterranean diet, we could actually solve 15% of global warming pollution by 2050.
If everyone were to move toward it, that is equivalent to taking somewhere around 1 billion cars off of the streets in terms of vehicle emissions each year. So that kind of a footprint is big time.
But say you still want more meat than the Mediterranean diet recommends. Just cutting down your portion size to the doctor recommended 4 ounces can reduce your emissions by half. That's huge.
In fact, the doctors are telling us we're eating about twice as much meat as we really need for a healthy diet.
all these things that you're already being told are good for you also happen to be good for the planet.
So what we eat really is a big part of the climate puzzle. I mean, we may not all be able to afford an electric car or putting solar panels on our house, but we all have to eat every day. And these choices we make can add up to really big numbers. And since meat has a pretty big carbon load, we need to be thoughtful about how much we eat. And so that ribeye steak that I really love, I am honestly trying to cut back. Maybe just a smaller piece of steak, or simply swapping out a meat dish for a veggie burger. It may seem like a small thing, but it really does add up to big impacts. Hey, so what did you have for dinner last night? Find out how your choices are affecting global warming by taking a quiz at climate.universityofcalifornia.edu.
I just want to throw in a tiny little thing. I noticed that in this video, when he talked about the Mediterranean diet, he said lots and lots of olive oil. I'm sorry, I have to throw in here the fact that in spite of a lot of this information that's thrown out there, no, olive oil is not healthy. No oil is healthy. Some are less harmful than others, but that's a whole other topic. Nonetheless, tons and tons of olive oil is not great. Plus, if you recall a couple of slides back, olive oil was actually fairly high up there on the greenhouse gas side of things. But nonetheless, generally speaking, the concept of the Mediterranean diet being a lot less meat and other animal products definitely makes a difference. This is another slide that just kind of shows you that again. Again, you know, different people say slightly different things about how much carbon footprint it is this versus that, but this is just another example. If you eat a lot of meat, you're on the far left there. If you just do an average amount of meat, you're at the 2.5. If you just cut out all beef, then you're down to 1.9. If you go vegetarian, again, vegetarians still consume dairy and eggs, which are still animal products, and finally down to the vegan. But the biggest difference is, you know, as you get between vegetarian and vegan, again, you're getting some incremental improvements. The biggest thing that makes the difference is cutting down on beef in particular and animal products in general. This is just another variation on that. This one shows, again, some different diets and the difference. On this one, that the black line with the two bars on either end, that shows the variance. But again, the vegan diet has no animal products at all diet has been shown to have the greatest impact as far as your carbon footprint reduction. And the Mediterranean on this chart is actually down there at the bottom. Still way better than your typical diet, but not nearly as much as some of these other diets are. I'd love to leave this stuff up longer, but I'm, you know, it'd take me 2 hours to do this presentation if I don't whiz through this stuff. So in conclusion on the global warming, these are the conclusions I've come to. Perhaps you came to some different ones, and you know, we can discuss that afterwards. But officially, only about 5% of Canada's greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture. However, that's based on that 100-year global warming potential of methane. My calculations figure it closer to about 9%. And again, that's not the those other higher numbers that are thrown out there that have to do with the whole life cycle. This is just the more direct stuff. And so, although 9% is a relatively small percent of the total, it's one of the areas that we have the most control over. We can control what we eat. I don't have a lot of control over how much oil gets pumped out of the ground or how much energy gets burnt producing electricity. Carbon footprint of plant food is much lower than animal foods. Claims that grass-finished beef have a lower carbon footprint is not supported by the science unless the number of cattle per acre is drastically reduced. Reducing or eliminating meat consumption, especially beef, can significantly reduce your diet-related carbon footprint. Eliminating animal products from your diet is equivalent to driving about 5,600 fewer kilometers per year. And if the rest of the world consumed as much animal products as we do, it could have a devastating impact on climate change. Unfortunately, my recommendations aren't what is necessarily best for the Alberta economy. That's, again, a different topic. Okay, let's move on to water consumption. I'll try and whip through these other sections a little at a faster pace so I don't keep you here all night. Water footprint of food. In the United States, agriculture is responsible for about 80% of all water consumed. And our diets account for more than 2/3 of our total water footprint. So if you figure out how much water you use up flushing toilets and washing dishes and all that kind of stuff, you'll find that about 2/3 of that our water footprint is from our food. In Canada, agriculture is the #1 consumer of water, with only 25% of the water it withdraws being returned to source. 85% of agricultural withdrawals of water are for irrigation and 15% for watering livestock. Alberta has approximately 60% of the irrigated croplands in Canada, and much of that's in the Saskatchewan River Basin. Agriculture in this region consumes roughly 2,200 million cubic meters a year from the river, and that removes about 28% of the total annual flow of the river. Canadian agriculture producers use approximately 2.95 billion cubic meters of water to irrigate their crops in 2018. And that's the amount of water that goes over Niagara Falls in 2 weeks. Alberta irrigation accounts for approximately 2/3 of the irrigated water applied to crops across the whole country. Field crops and forages are the most things that are irrigated, forages being the stuff that's fed to the animals. So a lot of our water use is in irrigating either the crops to feed us or the crops to feed the animals. This bar chart, the key thing on this one is taking a look at the second line from the bottom, irrigation. That's water allocations in Alberta are primarily for irrigation. That irrigation gets broken down into these areas, 33% for forages, i.e. animal feed, the rest 30% cereals, oil seeds at 13%, other specialty crops, and so on. So how much water does it take to produce a kilogram of food? Now, these are the kind of charts that the vegans love to throw up there and say, see, this is why you shouldn't eat animals, because they use way too much water. I'm going to throw these charts up there, and then I'm going to give you a counterpoint on this. Again, interestingly, chocolate's way up there. So this is liters of water to produce a kilogram of food, without taking into account the calories and protein, etc., just pure weight of the food. Again, with the exception of chocolate and nuts, it's the highest consumers of water are all the animal products. One of the reasons growing the cocoa plants that chocolate is made from takes a lot of water, and they're mostly in equatorial regions, so a lot of irrigation used for that. And then if it's milk chocolate, there's also the water content from producing the milk. Take a look at it from another point of view, liters of water to produce a calorie of food. Again, the animal products are mostly the top of the scale. And finally, looking at it from a protein point of view, butter hits the top of the charts here. Well, that's because butter is pretty much all fat. Chocolate, again, is quite high. Now fruits and nuts get up there because, again, there's not a lot of protein in fruits. Rice is also fairly high there because it takes a lot of water to grow rice. But again, the highest water consumption on grams of protein are, again, the animal products. If you substitute things like pulses, i.e. legumes and peas and stuff, for the meat products, are going to have a smaller water footprint. But not all water is the same, especially when it comes to producing our food. Basically, water breaks down into these three categories. Blue water, which is the amount of water that's taken from the surface water or groundwater and that for food, that's mostly from the point of view of irrigating our crops. Green water footprint is kind of the free water. That's the stuff that falls from the sky and feeds our crops and the pasture lands. So we don't care too much, to be honest, about what the green water footprint is, because, hey, it's nature gave it to us. A gray water footprint we do care about, because that's the amount of water you need to dilute the polluted water in order to bring it back up to a drinking standard. And for food, so this would be the water that would come from the pollution from agricultural runoff or leaching into the soils. Okay, so now understanding that there's different kinds of water, let's have a look at a meat lover's perspective.
Another criticism against cattle is that they're inefficient with water. I've heard things like it takes 10 bathtubs full of water in order to produce a hamburger. But the water methodology that they're typically referring to is actually not all drinking water. So there's a big difference between blue water and green water. Blue water is irrigation water. It's what you see when you look down on a map and see things in blue. Rainwater is green water and other water that's just sort of in the moisture of the grass. And so most of the water footprint, about 94% for typical cattle and 97% for grass finished cattle, is actually green water. It's just rain that naturally occurs anyway.
According to the beef industry, the life cycle analysis approach determined that it takes about 631 liters of blue water, i.e. surface or groundwater, to produce a kilogram of packed boneless beef delivered to consumers. All right, so like on this chart, you can get those little blue water droplets. That's the amount of blue water versus the green water, because the vast majority of the food that the cows eat, whether they're in grain finished or grass finished, they start their life eating grass, and we don't tend to irrigate pasture land. The only time really that the blue water comes into the picture, occasionally for grass finished, is if they have to, in drought times when they have to irrigate the crops that they feed the cows to supplement the not enough grass being available. And there's very little gray water there because most of the manure and everything just falls on the land, although there is some runoff from that into the river systems. So there is a difference here. Again, when we talked about greenhouse gas effect, the broad evidence seems to suggest the industrial beef is actually less impact on greenhouse gas, but on the water side of things, this is where the grass-fed beef has the smaller footprint, because very little blue and the gray water used compared to the water used to grow the crops, i.e. the corn and grain that's fed on the feedlots to the cows, and all the manure and stuff that's produced from that concentrated ton of animals on a very small space. All that manure they produce has to go someplace. Just a reminder as well, only about 98% of Canadian beef is grain finished. Again, these are the Canadian numbers according to the Beef Cattle Research Council. They didn't have any numbers for the gray water. But as you can see, most of the water footprint. So when you see all those like those earlier charts I showed you, where the big long things saying beef takes 10,000 times as much water as lentils, yeah, that's true, but it's mostly green water. These are the global averages. So now I've taken it, and for the data that I could find, that shows the blue, in this case, the gray is represented by the dark yellow there, and then the green water footprint. Nuts, again, is quite high. They tend to be irrigated. Just looking at the blue part on each of these bars, The animal products are still on the higher end of the scale versus the vegetable products. And in fact, generally it's somewhere around 2 to 4 times as much blue water to produce the same amount of animal products versus the plant products. So not nearly as bad as is often said, but still not as good as plants. But just to help illustrate where you are also makes a big difference, I threw in this chart of California's total water use. Again, California weather and conditions are a lot different than Alberta. But again, I threw this in mostly to illustrate the fact that it depends on where you live and stuff, what the water footprint actually is. But this kind of shows that when it comes to animal feed in California, about half of it is blue water, i.e. irrigated. For alfalfa, straw, and hay, it's mostly irrigated. Almonds, which is a big thing that comes from California, that's mostly blue water. But again, animal feed and stuff is the biggest amount of blue water usage in California. And that's also where we get a lot of our vegetables from. Shifting over to water pollution. Agriculture also is a big consumer of global fresh water and produces a lot of polluted water. It's a leading cause of water degradation around the world. In the US in particular, it's said to be the top source of contaminants in rivers and streams, second biggest source in wetlands, third main source in lakes, and a major contributor to contamination in estuaries and groundwater. Basically, every time it rains, fertilizer, pesticides, and animal waste from farms and livestock operations wash nutrients and pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, etc., into our waterways. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus gets into the air and the water, and that's the #1 threat to water quality. And that's what causes a lot of times these big algae blooms of toxic blue-green algae that gets in the water. That's largely agricultural runoff. And that's a mixture of the crops we eat and the crops we feed to animals. How has things changed? Well, traditionally, it wasn't as big a problem because animal waste was collected in straw, bedding, and composted before it was spread on the fields. And that allowed most of the pathogens to be killed by the heat of the composting. And it was a relatively small amount of waste that was being recycled as fertilizer on the land. But with our intensive livestock operations, we concentrate a large number of animals in a small space that produces a high volume of manure, and waste typically is sprayed or spread onto fields and pumped into waste lagoons. You may have seen videos and stuff in here. There's these outside of factory farms, there's these huge lagoons full of liquid manure and big sprinkler systems that are spraying that out onto the fields. In other cases, they're loaded in tanker trucks and driven out to the fields and put on it. Now, on the plus side, that manure is a wonderful fertilizer and helps the plants grow. And I've even heard farmers saying things like, well, if we got rid of all the animals, what the hell am I going to fertilize my crops with? So that's something to keep in mind. The problem is we have too much of it, and it's costly and hard to take it far away from where it's being produced. And so often there's problems that way. And you get things like lagoon ruptures and major leaks into storage systems. And perhaps some of you recall back in the year 2000, there was a problem where 7 people died and more than 2,300 became severely ill in Walkerton, Ontario, when their drinking water was contaminated with E. coli from cattle manure. One of the ways of measuring the pollution is this thing called BOD5, which is biochemical oxygen demand. It's how much oxygen is needed by the microorganisms to break down stuff. I just threw this up briefly here just to show again. It's the things that have the biggest demand hardest to be turned back into non-pollutant water are the pollutions from the dairy farms, the pig slurries, cattle slurries, and so on. There's a problem with deteriorating state of water in Lake Winnipeg, and that's been attributed in large part to the excessive phosphorus emissions from Manitoba's pork industry. Livestock manure is one of the principal non-point sources of nutrient pollution in Canada. So this is an issue. Meat processing, wastewater produced from livestock processing is laden with fats, proteins, and carbohydrates of meat, fat, blood, skin, and feathers. There's also pollution from grit and inorganic matter, and even various pathogens that all end up getting out into the either the water systems or whatever. Now, we do have rules in Canada about having to process all this effluent before it gets put back into the water system. The question is, how well is it enforced? That's a question mark, and I don't have an answer to that. Let's hope for the most part it is being treated before getting back into our water system. A certain amount of it also leaks into the air. Any of you guys ever lived close to an animal production facility? I used to live not too far when I was living in Southern Ontario. I wasn't too far away from a pig operation. And I tell you, when the wind was blowing from there to where I was living, you certainly knew about it. So anyways, there's two big problems here are odors and ammonia, and they can go quite a distance in the air from these intensive livestock operations. All right, so conclusions I've drawn from the information I found about water and animal agriculture is, first of all, the claims often made about high water consumption to produce animal products don't take into account that about 87% of that water is green water. So not nearly as bad as a lot of the memes and stuff you've probably seen posted. Nonetheless, when you compare the blue and gray water needed to produce plant foods to animal foods, it's still generally 2 to 4 times more water for the animal products. Water use, from water use point of view, this is where the grass finished beef actually is better than the grain finished, because it's almost all green water, whereas the grain finished, a lot of the crops that are fed to the animals are irrigated. Water and air pollution from intensive livestock operations is a problem. The place where surface and groundwater is in short supply, the water used to irrigate crops, be those crops fed to animals or people, can become a problem. Interesting to note, if crops are fed directly to people instead of animals, a lot less crops would be needed and consequently less blue and gray water needed. So in times of drought and stuff, this can become a big issue, and feedback effect, global warming is creating more droughts, meaning more irrigation needed, and consequently more problems with shortage of water. So again, it's better if we can reduce the amount of water we consume with our diets. And you can do that by consuming less animal products. Okay, final topic here, land usage, habitat destruction, and wildlife. Again, this deserves an hour of its own time, but I'm just gonna hit the highlights. This is a neat little thing again from that Sacred Cow presentation that talks about land use and how potentially animal agriculture is good for the environment.
So I'm going to walk you through this experiment. We're going to call it Grass World. So if you were to picture another planet that was, the same kind of weather patterns as Earth, and it was just kind of covered in dirt, and you wanted to start a sustainable, self-sufficient food system, what would you start with first? And so, imagine a bunch of scientists got together and they thought the first thing they want to do is secure that dirt in the ground, and so they're going to plant grass. So we're going to call this Grass World. Okay, you come back to Grass World about a year or two later, and what do you find? Dead grass. And why did that happen? Well, there was nothing fertilizing the grass. There was nothing breaking it down biologically. It just sort of grew and oxidized and died. And so the scientists all get together and they think, Well, we need something that's going to fertilize the grass, and so they could either fly in some fertilizer, or they could have self-replicating fertilizing machines that could biologically break down the grass. They could fertilize the grass, they could keep it trimmed. And so the next version of this world is grass cow world. So now we've got the cows chewing the grass, they're keeping it trimmed, they're fertilizing it with their urine and their manure. But what could be the problem here? People come back, the next year, a year later, and they found that the cows overgrazed the grass. There were too many cattle. The grass all died. The cows ran out of food, and the cows died too. So back to the drawing board, plant some more grass, but we need something to keep the population in check, and also keep them moving so that they're not eating all their favorite grasses and overgrazing. So the thought is to have grass cow wolf world. With the predator pressure of the wolves, we've got the cattle moving along nicely. They're not overgrazing too much in one individual spot, and their populations are under control because the weaker ones are getting culled by the wolves. And everything is sort of working in a nice equilibrium here, except, it's still kind of a delicate situation, because what if some virus came and attacked the wolves or the cows? Then you've got a huge problem. And so that's why biodiversity is so important. Complexity equals resilience. So the more different types of predators, different grazers, different animals that can support the underground world with worms and different bacteria, the healthier the ecosystem is. And that's why we need biodiversity. And of course, when we look at natural systems, that's what we see in grasslands. We see large herds bunched closely together for protection, moving frequently away from the predators. And that's how grasslands co-evolved with ruminant animals. And of course, humans can mimic the predator pressure just by using electric fencing. And this keeps the animals from overgrazing and allows the land that they've previously grazed a chance to rest. This graphic shows the difference between continuous grazing and then a more managed or adaptive grazing model. So on the left, we have continuous grazing where the animals have constant access to the entire pasture, less wildlife habitat, more exposed soil, less diverse forage, increased rainfall runoff, and more parasite pressure on the cattle. When we look at a managed grazing system where the farmer is or rancher is moving the cattle depending on conditions, we have less parasite pressure, we have healthier animals, and this is actually how we can sequester carbon and increase biodiversity, because we're allowing the grass that they just grazed a very long rest period. Another common criticism against cattle is that livestock take up 3/4 of our agricultural land. But the reality is that grazing animals actually make use of land that's not suitable for cropping. So 85% of the US beef cattle population right now is grazing on land that we actually cannot crop. So many people argue that if we just removed cattle that we would have much more land for growing crops, but that's not actually the case. So about 60% of our agricultural land globally is either too rocky, too steep, or too arid for crop production, but animals like cattle and other grazing animals actually thrive in environments like these. Also, only about 40% of the animal is used for meat. The rest is all.
Okay, I'm going to cut that a bit short just because I'm quite long. There's a couple of valid points in here in terms of cattle largely grazing on land that's not suitable for other crops. That being true, I do think it's a little bit funny that she's using the biodiversity argument to try and say why we should have cows grazing on the field when that's anything but biodiverse, because we have nothing but the same breed of cow, and we've gotten rid of all the predators such as the coyotes and wolves and bears and such. It is true, however, that the grazing land that the cattle use is still home for many kinds of smaller animals. So if you, I would say from a biodiversity point of view, grazing land used by cattle is better than straight cropland that's just, all plowed and seeded. Not a lot of wildlife living in those kind of land versus the pasture land. And to a limited degree, it's true what she says about the cattle grazing, if it's done properly, with not too many numbers. The cattle basically replaced the buffalo that used to roam the prairies and the grasslands. That they are part of a system. So it's a mixed thing in my opinion. I had another video here that just more debunking that, but I don't know, taking too much time here. I'll just highlight a couple of things out of there. This is just shows you how much land is being used. So 29% of the Earth's surface is land, 71% of that is habitable, 50% of that is agriculture land. Of that agriculture land, 77% is livestock, meat and dairy, and only 23% is crops. But that 77% of the land only produces 18% of the calories. This is an interesting map I came across that if you took all the same kind of land and chunked it together in the US, it shows the relative size of it. The nice big yellow thing in the section middle there is all pasture land. Most of it's used by cows. The square on the right-hand corner of that is all the land being used to grow food to feed to animals. And then that little green rectangle is the land used to grow the food we eat. So as you can see, a lot more land being used for animals than for people. Again, a lot of that pasture land would not be suitable for growing crops, but if we didn't have all the animals to feed, we wouldn't need all that livestock feed area. I did some math here. I used these numbers from another farm in California that talks about how they're doing it all the right way to be good for the environment. So I took their numbers, and they have one cow-calf pair on 10 acres, 80,000 pounds of finished beef. There's a bunch of math involved. The bottom line is, if based on the number of pounds of meat Americans eat, pounds of beef Americans eat, if all that meat was going to be produced in that nice ecologically friendly way, it would take 1.1 billion acres of land just for beef production. Similarly, they had pigs. And when you run all the math on the pigs, and you add that on to the cows, you would need 4 billion acres to produce the beef and pork that Americans eat in this environmentally friendly way. And there's only 1.9 billion acres of land in the lower 48. So again, a reminder from the beginning is 98 to 99% of the meat, the beef in the United States and Canada is grain finished. If we all went to the grocery store and demanded that we only are going to buy grass-fed meat, but did not reduce our consumption, there ain't enough land to do it. Same numbers done in Canada, and we would need 311 million acres for beef and pork alone. And yet in Canada, we have a total of 167 million acres of farmland, of which 89 million is cropland. And these are based on numbers in California. If you wanted to do that same ranching in Alberta with our colder climate, the numbers would be worse. Bottom line, you cannot produce the amount of meat we currently consume in an environmentally friendly way. A couple of things about intensive livestock operations in Canada. That's the norm. Compared to nations in the global south, Canada has less land use change. Canada does experience land degradation. in its form of soil compaction erosion that results from grazing on dry land. 73% of the world's dry rangelands and pastures have been degraded as a result of compaction erosion from cattle, basically too many cows on a certain chunk of land. And that happens in the Canadian prairies as well. And it's, as I said, it is possible that if more cattle were grass-fed on existing grasslands to supply the growing niche market for grass-fed beef, that would result in greater overgrazing than of already degraded grasslands. Land use per 100 grams of protein, again, the biggest users of land are the animal products, a huge amount. Again, the counter argument to that is a lot of that land you couldn't grow crops on anyways. Fair enough. Taking a look at it from calories per acre, as you can see, soybeans is going to get you a lot more calories per acre, as well as other plant-based products that are meat alternatives like beans and lentils over the amount of meat you can produce. Meat calories you can produce per acre are a lot smaller. Interestingly, the University of Alberta did a study very recently in August of last year, talking about animal grazing, reducing biodiversity around the world. The study they did, a couple of highlights from there. Anthropogenic disturbance has generally a significant loss of biodiversity worldwide, and grazing by domestic herbivores is contributing to this disturbance. Without going through all the wording, bottom line is, generally speaking, livestock reduces biodiversity compared with if you took the livestock off the land. If you just took all the cows off and let that land go back to nature, you will get greater biodiversity most of the time. There are some situations where there was some evidence that livestock actually were helping with the land, but that's not the general case. So yes, the cows are grazing on land that's not suitable for growing vegetables, but on the other hand, if we just ate more vegetables, we wouldn't need so many cows, and we could let more of this land go back to nature and have much better biodiversity. This is just another chart. I won't go through any of the detail of it, from another thing called Livestock's Long Shadow, Environmental Issue and Option, lots of stuff in that document, but this is just, again, showing the effects on biodiversity of animal agriculture. This is another research paper, very recent. We'll talk about food system impacts on biodiversity loss, and talked about 3 levers for food system transformation in support of nature. And these are some of the key things from the report. Those little circles on the right there show the amount of biodiversity. As you can see, the wild mammals are only 4% of all the mammals on Earth right now. And in case of the birds, the wild birds are only 29%. Most of the rest of it is all the farm chickens and ducks and geese, turkeys, etc. So biodiversity loss is accelerating around the world. Global food system is the primary driver of this trend. Without reform, our food system biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate. They suggest 3 things we can do. Global dietary patterns need to converge around diets based more on plants. More land needs to be protected and set aside for nature, and need to farm in a more nature-friendly, biodiversity supporting way. Let me just quickly diverge over to fishing. I would love to spend a ton of time on that because that's a big problem too. But as this slide illustrates, not only is fishing depleting our oceans of fish, it is also killing off an awful lot of other marine life, such as dolphins. My conclusions about animal agriculture and land use. takes a lot of land to produce animal products, much more than plant foods. There's not enough land to produce our current demand for animal products without using the intensive livestock operations. Grazing animals can use land that is not suitable for growing crops. Animals can eat food that's not suitable for people. So a lot of the stuff that would otherwise go to waste can be fed to animals from a food point of view. Animal agriculture generally has a negative impact on biodiversity, but done properly can, to a limited degree, promote it. Grazing land can be shared between livestock and smaller animals and birds, but what we generally find is farmers don't want to share their land with the bigger animals, particularly the predators, so they kill them. Fishing not only depletes our oceans, but it's also killing a lot of other marine mammals, sharks and fish we don't eat. So, in conclusion, is animal agriculture bad for the environment? The short answer is yes. Animal agriculture in its current form is contributing to global warming, contributing to water depletion and pollution, contributing to habitat biodiversity loss and land degradation. Do we have to stop eating all animals? From an environmental point of view, as opposed to my vegan point of view, no. But we do need to drastically reduce our animal product consumption and adopt practices that minimize emissions, water consumption, pollution impacts on wildlife and habitats. I'll just also finish off with a brief mention. There's an organization that spent a whole bunch of time, did a whole lot of research, and they came up with a planetary health diet. This diet is not only good for our health as eaters of the food, but also the health of the planet. And as you can see in this chart, it's based around primarily consumption of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, unsaturated plant oils, and plant source proteins also playing a large role, and a small amount of meat and dairy. This just shows how our current diet compares to this planetary health diet. As you can see, we do way more meat consumption and other animal product consumption than is the ideal from a planetary and human health point of view, and not nearly enough fruits and vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. Good news, adopting a primarily plant-based diet is not only good for the environment, it's also good for your health and minimizes unnecessary animal suffering. And I apologize for taking so long. I will now end the presentation.
Okay, Mike, can you stop sharing?
Yep.
Perfect. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to say, wow, that was phenomenal. The amount of research you did is amazing. You were very, very well organized. We are close to 9, and I've got some notes from people in the chat saying they have to go.
Yeah.
So one of the things I was just chatting, Janalee and I were just texting because we usually sort of end around 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rush the questions. I've got a couple questions. I know there's been some questions that have shown up.
I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah, so yeah, that would be great. But some people have to run, so I don't want them to miss out either. So what I thought we might do is, Janalee and I thought we could have another session. Would you be willing to do a part 2 where you can answer some questions in more detail? Sure. Where people could come, but at the same time, we can still have people answer your ask questions right now if they're willing to stay.
Yeah. Yeah, we do another session where I don't do a presentation.
Yes.
Just, we discuss what I presented.
If you want to do another presentation, that
maybe sometime in the future, but
that must have taken you forever to do.
It took many hours of research, but you know what? I really enjoyed the process.
It was very,
and I learned a lot as a result. I'm guilty of in the past just accepting the stuff that people were saying and but not.
But it really felt like
applying skepticism to it.
Yeah, and it felt to me like you were being really trying to be unbiased and offering sides, which I think is really important. And I learned a lot. So here's from Pamela. She's gone already, but she said, and you can read these yourself and actually save them if you want. So it says, fabulous presentation, Mike. Thanks so much. Your hard work has been appreciated. Sadly, I must go. So, but very eye-opening, he said, she said. So I think that's generally, could Mike's presentation be put on Google Drive? What a great question, Lois. So, your slides, if we can get a hold of them, we can put them on Google Drive and let everybody see them, which would be nice too for people to look at who couldn't be here, and then they can bring questions to your second session.
I can definitely do that.
Perfect.
And the videos I played are built into the PowerPoint, so they should all come as a nice package.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you. So I think that's a great idea, Lois. Thank you. So, and I think for myself, I want to go through it again because there were some things that I just need to kind of absorb. There was a lot of information that was in there, and it was really good. So let's go through. Let's go to the top here. There's lots of comments. And if you have any questions, do put them in the chat. And okay. So here's one. It says, is the methane that cattle produce mostly caused by the feed they are given instead of grass?
Yes. And that's actually one of the areas there's a lot of research going on right now in terms of how can we have the cows produce less methane by adjusting their diet.
Yeah, and actually on the SGU, you know the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast? Yeah. Yes, they were talking about that recently, about a seafood diet that you add. It was based on seaweed, I think it was.
Yes.
And it reduced up to, I think it was 80%.
Yeah.
Methane.
And again, whenever I hear those sort of things, what my mind jumps to, not questioning whether it works,
right,
but then questioning, okay, what's the downstream effect then?
Right.
Where's all this seaweed going to come from, and what's the environmental impact of that?
That's right.
I really like it. It's extremely hard to do, but to get the life cycle behind that stuff.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there's things we can do that reduce the amount of methane produced by the cattle. And, in the end, is that going to be good or bad overall? I don't know.
Yes.
But it's
Early
being
days.
researched. Absolutely.
Yeah, early days.
And that's also, again, one of the reasons why the feedlot fed cows have lower methane emissions, because the feed it puts on the weight quicker, and secondly, it does produce less methane.
Okay, good, great answer. And Maria has a question, which is, are there studies showing the impact of vegan food production, both on GHG emissions and environmental impact overall? Question.
It's sort of yes and no. I haven't seen anything that was specifically, so when you say vegan food, I'm going to translate that into plant food. All right. Again, because it's not like it's only vegans who are allowed to eat apples and bananas and potatoes. It's plant food, which is what is the only things that vegans eat. So indirectly, again, a lot of these slides and stuff I showed in here are contrasting the land, the water, and the gases of plant products versus animal products. So indirectly, yes. I haven't actually ever come across a study that specifically was, what are the environmental impacts of vegan food? I have, sort of as a side effect, again, though, in many cases, that the argument is put out there that says, but if we got rid of all the cows and pigs and everything, that's actually not the ideal system. And again, purely from a how much food can we produce point of view, that's true. And most of the studies and stuff that I showed that weren't just one-sided, that's a conclusion they came to, was that there is room for some animal products, but not as much as we're doing now.
And I
we
think
need to shift.
It feels like it's common knowledge that doctors, my doctor has said reduce meat. I've talked to dietitians with regards to my kids, registered dietitians, and they say, no more meat than the palm of a small part of your palm of your hand. that kind of thing. I think it's well known. It's just that we're not doing it necessarily. And I loved what you show, how you showed the Mediterranean diet is way down there with the vegetarian and the vegan. I mean, it's an interesting thing. And that sort of leads into Pamela's comment. Essentially, basically, from what you were saying, she says, a simple way of thinking of it is just eat less beef and chicken in general. It's just sort of the way.
Yep, the less animal products you consume, particularly beef, the lower your carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Again, putting that in perspective, that's only, you know, the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture as a whole, including animals, is still only a small percent
Right.
of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But hey, you know, every bit counts when we're trying to save the planet.
Exactly. And Christopher has quite a few really interesting comments that I saw in here. One of them is that it's important to remember these are integrated systems. Feeding cattle often provides a place to use feed grains, which can't be grown necessarily in other places, or to recycle other sources, which I thought was an interesting comment.
And that is true.
And oh, here's Janelle saying, you can take away my beef, but don't even try to take away my chocolate.
Well, I was very disappointed when I saw that. I'm an alcoholic, so I'm going, oh no, you're trying to tell me I have to cut back on chocolate?
Exactly. I agree. And Maria has an interesting notice. She says alcohol production is not anywhere in here. I guess that's not really considered a food in some ways, maybe.
No, it's not something I came across in any of my research. So that's
interesting.
That would be interesting to know.
And then I think Helen put in a link for people in the chat for resilience.org. I'm not sure what it is. It's about something about sacred cow.
Yeah.
And she says she agrees with small farming for beef consumption versus large scale production. When you know your rancher and purchase from them, it benefits many other areas. So I think you would agree with that. That's sort of what you were saying about the smaller farms, right? Giving more land to less cows.
Again, the big problem here is the reason we have these large scale farming things is because that's what's needed to supply the amount of meat we're eating.
Right.
So if all of us, not me, of course, because I don't eat meat anyways, but the people who do eat meat, if all of you just said, okay, I'm only going to eat meat from small scale farms, you're going to have to drastically reduce the amount of meat you consume.
That's correct. Yeah.
You can't produce that amount of meat on a small scale.
That's right. And that's very true. Maria says, what is the food weight comparison for animal protein versus plant protein? Is it pretty equal? For example, kilograms of beef versus kilograms of, say, lentils and soy?
I don't have exact numbers, but if you take a closer look at again, I had to whiz through some of those charts quickly, but if you take the time and look back when I post the presentation at some of those charts, they do break it down, you know, at a calorie level or a protein level. I don't have a direct number that says, you know, what is the weight of a gram of protein of lentils versus a gram of protein of meat.
Right.
There are plenty of, if you go out in the net and you look for protein sources, you can easily find tons of things that list, you know, how much protein is in broccoli and so on. But yeah, you would have to eat weight-wise, you'd have to eat a lot more broccoli by pure weight than meat. Meat is a concentrated form of protein.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you for that. And Larry just has a comment here, as he says his nephew has a PhD in environment and has met with farmers in the US, and his research explained to them that they are wasting money by fertilizing to the edge of their farms. The research suggests that they could stay 25 to 30 feet away from the edge of their property because the fertilizer tends to naturally migrate through rain. So I thought that was an interesting comment to share. And then Christopher again says that Alberta, I think this is relating to some of the manure getting into the water systems. Alberta has a fairly strong legislation for manure management. The Agricultural Operation Practices Act. It is not allowable to release manure into water in Alberta, and we have a higher than average regulation, apparently, through the NRCB. So that's good to know. Yeah, really good to know.
And
Thanks, Chris.
again, also, as with anything though, there's a difference between the regulations and the enforcement.
Right.
One hopes that they're following the rules.
I know
would be
that if you break them and you get caught, it's pretty severe, I think.
I'm not leaving.
Oh,
Are
you
you
just
trying to get attention, Larry?
Yeah, I just wait. The city will inject the sewage into your farm land. They inject it like a foot below, but you have to go 2 years into follow.
Ah,
But
okay.
that's how they get rid of the solid waste.
Interesting. Okay,
And-
thanks, Larry. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, there's various ways one way of doing it is spraying the manure over the crop. Another way, in many cases, if it's close enough, they'll actually pipe it under the ground, and that's probably the preferred way.
Mm,
Then the nutrients are going straight to the roots,
fair
and
enough.
you're not potentially putting
Contaminating things.
biological agents on the plants.
Yeah.
There's been numerous recalls of
Lettuce.
plant
particularly.
products like lettuce and
Yeah.
spinach and stuff. I don't know in any of those cases if they truly traced it back to the source, but I always suspect in those cases it's probably was
The manure.
either polluted on the farmland with the manure, but it may be that somewhere in the processing it got contaminated. It's hard to say.
So the next question is from Helen, and it says, is there a comparative for transportation of animal consumption versus vegetarian consumption? Because we still have to transport unless we buy exclusively local. That's a good question.
And again, on some of those, one of those charts, it did list both animal and plant products, and the very small proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions which are from transport.
I was really surprised about the amount for beef, especially in Alberta, if it's local. And we have to bring all our vegetables in mostly through the winter, right? So I was quite surprised by that.
But also you got to remember the vast majority of those cows are not slaughtered on site, right? They're all loaded into trucks. And again, about 98% go to a feedlot first. That's not to say you could go to your local farmer and buy a side of beef from them. I have done that in the past when, long before I became vegan. And they may or may not, actually slaughter their cows on site.
Right. No, good point.
So in that case, you are eliminating that piece of it, but the vast majority of cows get loaded on the trucks and driven to feedlots, and then they're fattened up for a few months. And often the slaughterhouses are close to the feedlot, so there's not much transport there.
Right.
Yeah.
And Marin asked, do you see any reason to be optimistic about the reverse of global warming, considering how humans as a crowd behave? A good question.
I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to say no because I see a lot of bad stuff, but I'm saying yes because there is a lot of effort going on, not necessarily on the part of the end user, but on the part of the producers. They are taking this seriously for the most part, and the beef industry and so on are doing what they can, and in many cases they can do a lot to try and reduce their impact. So yeah, I do have hope because there are a lot of people that are working very hard, a lot of smart people who are finding solutions.
I like that.
I'm hoping they find them fast enough. to make up
Exactly.
for those of us who don't make such smart decisions.
And Hai just says she had to go, but learned a lot, and wow. So well done. I think you were very greatly appreciated here. So Neil has a question, and I hope I say this right, Neil, and if I don't, please feel free to step in here. Has the reliance on animal proteins been proved inaccurate? I'm thinking he means like, I'm guessing he means like if you eat beef, it's good for your iron, that
Sure.
kind of thing. It's easily absorbed and so
Yeah.
on.
So this is a bit off topic because I wanted to keep this topic based on the environmental impacts, but
Right.
I'm happy to, now that we're off the formal presentation, to deviate a bit. This is a controversial area. I believe the preponderance of science is now saying that this concept of a complete protein that had been pushed in the past is a myth, that there is no problem getting all the proteins you need with a well-rounded plant-based diet. As far as outright being protein deficient, that is virtually impossible.
What
on a
about iron
plant-based
though?
diet, if you, okay, we'll get to iron in just a sec,
Yeah.
but in just in case of protein,
Right.
even vegans, studies have shown that even vegans get more protein than we need.
Right. Yeah.
So if you consume the normal amount of calories, you almost can't be protein deficient. Now, if you're a bodybuilder or whatever, okay, you're
Right.
going to need more. And as you get older, you don't absorb the protein as easily.
Oh, interesting.
And whether you're a meat eater or not. The iron is another interesting one. I actually was listening to a video last night that said we get too much iron. And that is one of the things that is leading to Alzheimer's.
Oh, I never heard that one.
I hadn't either until last night.
Yeah. Well, I can speak from as a woman, one of our
Yeah.
problems being female is iron deficiency. And I've
Yeah.
been iron deficient a
And-
couple times. And that they always say,
Yeah.
and they don't like you to take iron supplementation for too long because it can cause liver problems.
Yeah.
So they always say eat red meat, right? That's
Yeah.
sort of their,
And that is a one of the common things. So as far as potential nutrient deficiencies on a plant-based diet goes, probably the most crucial one is B12. The reason is there's no B12 in plant food unless you don't wash it. The B12 is the bacteria in the soil. The problem is we clean our vegetables off. On the plus side, we're not getting all kinds
For
of other
good reason.
stuff we don't want. But in the past, we would get B12 from the dirt that we consumed along with the vegetables. And that's how the animals are getting their B12, because they don't wash their food before they eat it.
got it.
And that's where the B12 gets into the animal products. So yes, but because of the way we're raising our animals now, they are actually supplementing animals with B12 because they're not getting enough,
Interesting.
because
So
they're
do
getting a
you-
lot of their food on the food lot
So you
instead of,
supplement with B12 then?
pardon me?
Do you supplement with B12?
Yes. I
Yes,
do.
okay, sorry.
So that's one thing. And by the way, there's a lot of meat eaters can be B12 deficient as well, but that's one of the key things. If you're going to be on a plant-based diet, either get yourself tested regularly or just take a B12 supplement.
Right.
It's no big deal.
Interesting.
Iron is another common problem. It's not necessarily universal among plant eaters. There is iron in a variety of food.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And
Spinach,
there's different cooking techniques and stuff that affect the absorption of the
Yes.
iron.
Yes, yeah,
Things like spinach has a good deal of iron, but you don't absorb very much of it
correct.
unless it's combined with vitamin C
Right.
and or steamed to release
Right.
most of it.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of vegans, by the way, who go to a raw. They decide that a raw diet is optimal. And there's evidence that there's health in to eating raw, but the evidence I've looked at, I'm not sold on 100% raw.
No.
In
Well,
fact,
and I think
there's a lot of nutrients. There's nutrients lost in cooking, but there's also more bioavailability.
Correct, yes.
So
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
I'm not a proponent of all raw or high raw, but certainly there's good to eat some of your food raw.
Hard on the jaw when you have raw diet.
Yeah.
Like,
You
I
do
love
have
my
to-
veggie
you
sticks, but
gotta
oh.
eat a lot. You gotta eat a lot more because you're not going to absorb as much.
Exactly.
Yeah, so watch out for iron. The one other thing, of course, in Canada, it doesn't matter whether you consume animal products or not. We're all pretty much D3 and deficit during the winter time.
Yeah, go outside, right?
Now, one of the other things, a lot of the artificial meat substitutes are fortified.
Oh,
For example, there is a grain-based sausage that I love from a company called Field Roast. And a single sausage has twice the daily requirements of B12 in it, plus iron, protein, etc. So
Right.
I don't advocate eating a lot of processed imitation meat products.
Yeah.
But on the plus side, they are often supplemented with the vitamins. Similarly, milk, dairy milk does not have vitamin D in it. It's supplemented into
Yes,
the
that's
milk.
correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
And likewise into the plant-based milks.
Right. Yes.
Calcium is one of the other things, but the right combination of plant products will give you enough calcium as well.
Right. You just have to be well informed, I guess, to have a balanced diet anytime. It doesn't have to be whether or
again,
not
yeah.
you're eating with meat or not, right? It's
But again, I don't spend a good deal of my time planning out. I don't calculate how much protein and carbo and all that stuff is in my food, but I do eat a good variety
yes,
of.
and that's
I
always
try and stick mostly to whole
important.
foods.
So I don't know who this is. I think it's from Lois, because I think sometimes when she sends a question, it just says it says nobody to everyone. So Lois, you can let me know if this is your question or not. There are 2 essential amino acids that are rare in plants, but by careful study, it is possible to include the right plant material to provide those amino acids. Do you know what those are, amino acids?
I don't know what the names of them are off the top of my head.
Okay, but you're aware of those?
I'm aware of that. And again, I'm also aware that to a large degree, there used to be a theory going around that you had to do a certain combination of foods in order to get all the amino acids in a given. The key thing is you don't need to get all the amino acids in any one meal.
Right.
You do need to get enough of them overall in your diet.
And then it says heme iron in meat is absorbed by the body much better than the sulfur iron compounds found in plants, but chimps eat meat about once in 2 weeks. I didn't even know they ate meat, to be honest. That's interesting. So
Yeah, occasionally they do. It's not a major part of their diet, but
Right.
they do occasionally.
Very often other chimps, yeah.
Yeah, often from fights with other chimps for sure. And a lot of people who have gone vegan for ethical reasons, at some point go back to eating some meat. And because they feel, personally, I'd say I've been vegan for 10 years. I know many people have been vegan much longer, and I haven't ever felt the need to consume any animal products since I've gone vegan. But other people definitely have felt like they weren't getting something right in their diet and have resorted to eating small amounts of animal products, and that seemed to do the job for them. My purpose here tonight isn't to sell you all on veganism, as much as that is something that I do in general. I promote veganism. What I do want to promote here tonight is, from an environmental point of view, is if you're not going to eliminate eating animal products altogether, you can help the environment by at least reducing it and making some choices on how that meat is raised.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think we went through all the questions. There's just one last comment from Maria, which she's talking about. I would like to have a wider lens conversation in the future about overall impact of agriculture, both environmentally, but also the impact on local people, looking on a more global scale. She says she has read that agriculture across the globe is extremely political, with huge implications for the, quote, little people. So perhaps a good discussion for another time. And I agree.
And again, there was just no way I could cram that into my presentation, but absolutely
That would be another 3
everything.
hours.
And just like with COVID, right? It's, yeah, if the health officials were running the show, everything would be shut down.
That's right.
And that would be optimal for stopping COVID, but not necessarily optimal for our survival in terms of being able to afford to buy some food to eat and
right.
stuff, right? So yeah, and that is so true with everything. This was focused on environmental impacts, but absolutely the Alberta, in particular, the Alberta economy, a huge part of it is animal agriculture, just like a huge amount of our economy is the oil industry. And so as an environmentalist, I would love to say, hey, let's shut down the oil sands. On the other hand, I would be out of a job. I don't work directly in the oil industry, but I can tell you if the oil industry shut down, so would my small company.
Right.
So yeah, it's ultimately, that's where the politicians have to do things. They have to try and balance all these conflicting things
right.
off and say, how much of this can we do? How much of that can we do? I don't have the magic answers.
Well, I think that, this is a good time where it's at 9:30 almost.
Yeah.
I think, everyone's
thank you, guys.
clapping. It was really, really good.
Well done, Mike.
Yes, well
As
done.
as a fellow vegan, nicely put. Your natural biases were not to the fore.
Correct.
Yes,
Better vegan.
you're
Very
far
commendable.
more even-minded than I could have been. That's for sure.
I cringed at times having to put stuff out there that goes against my what I want to be true, but that's the
Thank you, Mike. As a total carnivore, I really, you gave me a lot of food that I can munch on for a few weeks.
Well, thanks for saying that.
I am